Thank you for coming. I know some of you it was an ordeal. It wasn't for me because of Tom Hutchison, so a shout out to Tom. I was his storm child overnight last night. I don't even remember storm child from Garrison Keillor, but I was Tom's storm child. And very gracious, thank you so much, Tom. It was a lot easier to get here. Otherwise, I'd be on Zoom too. Manifest destiny. You probably heard the term. The idea behind manifest destiny is that God Almighty, the God that created the cosmos, the sun, the stars, everything that we can see, has a direct, or has a direct role in the formation of the United States of America. Its acquisitiveness, a territory, how it looks, what we did. In God's name? I don't know. But there's another part to that destiny, and that's God Almighty help you if you happen to be in the way. So what I'm going to talk about is, I'm very skeptical of manifest destiny. I don't buy into the theory at all. Not sorry guys, but no. But then I see this. The river, the third largest river basin in the world. The longest naturally navigable, not the longest river, but the longest naturally navigable river in the world. I can go from the Gulf of Mexico to St. Anthony Falls. There's no rapids, there's no waterfalls. It's amazing. So if God didn't put it there, right on the western boundary of our country, who put it there? But there it is. So what I have is this inter-territory, interstate superhighway sitting right where it has to be. And the thing I think I needed was what to run on the highway. And what you see here is what we invented to run. So this presentation is going to cover this in a little bit more detail, what these things are. So I'll skip for that for later. But we don't think about, I've never thought about Cincinnati, maybe St. Louis, Cincinnati and Pittsburgh as major shipbuilding centers in the United States. But for a time they were. For the time of rivers, they were. Now the thing about the river, it wasn't perfect. There were droughts. And in fact, I just was remembering this. Last September 2022, we couldn't get a full grain barge down the Mississippi River. There wasn't enough water. So it wasn't perfect. There were floods, very bad. And for us, we have to deal with 5 or is it 6 months of winter. That river's just not get navigable all year round. Neither is the Great Lakes. So it wasn't perfect. But there was another technology coming along. And the way I phrase this is, for the river world, for the riverboats, the light at the end of the tunnel was a train. So the railroads, 1850 is when it really exploded. So these two technologies, riverboats, steamships, and steam trains, they started in the United States just about the same time. It's kind of really strange. But they were bottled up on the East Coast. Trains were. They didn't, Mother Nature didn't make the highway. Monopolists made the highway. Every black line you see on these pictures was some monopoly. Now, land and politicians cost money. And the idea is that if you own a monopoly, it's great to own a railroad. I would love to own a railroad. But it's even better if you can make money on that railroad. And it was a lot harder to do on the East Coast. Everything was more expensive. The other thing was, you can almost kind of see it. It's not on these maps, but there was like this Appalachian, not a wall, but a barrier. You had to get over that. You can kind of see it, we even leaked around it in Detroit and Chicago. But when we punched through it, finally, I can't remember all the places, but I know Cumberland Gap was one. Let's see, anyway, I can't get the other one. It'll come to me. But the idea is that once we got through the Appalachians, the water metaphor, the floodgates open. And the railroads take over everything. And the reason was, it should be obvious, it's a 24/7 by 365 technology. Now, they couldn't run every day. There were storms, things didn't quite work. But if you think about it compared for winter, the northern part of the United States, the railroads were ideal. And really for ideal was Chicago. During the time that I'm going to cover in this presentation, there were 120 trains arriving and departing Chicago every single day. It made Chicago. The railroads made Chicago. So what I'm talking about is different destinies the destiny of a steamboat era, the destiny of a railroad era. And a place where they cross, those destinies meet up at a place called the Hellgate. Now, you probably have never, this is why the Hellgate. I'll allude to this in just a minute. I'll talk about what it is. You can see Chicago 1852, and it's hard to read, but it's just piece by piece by piece. This monopoly, the Rock Island Railway, which ends, believe it or not, in Rock Island, Illinois, coming across the state of Illinois, piece by piece by piece by piece. And it hits right there at Rock Island. Now, if you cross the river at Rock Island, there's Davenport, Iowa. And there's also, I don't have a map of it, but also a railroad moving from Davenport to Council Bluffs. So you can kind of see how this is working. Each of these railroads is a monopoly, but you are much more likely to make money on a monopoly when they're connected together at their terminuses. So where would I put a railroad if there's already a railroad across the river in Davenport? Or where would I put a bridge? Rock Island. That's where the Hellgate goes. So what is the Hellgate? Why is it called the Hellgate? Well, it was a editorial in the Galena News when they were building this bridge, the first rail bridge across the United States. It was given the nickname the Hellgate, a gate from hell. And the idea was, before the Hellgate, on the father of all waters, the Mississippi River, your journey from the Gulf of Mexico to St. Anthony Falls was whatever barriers you find would be natural. Mother Nature put them there. We're going to take them out. But now the Hellgate was the first time there was a barrier that wasn't made by Mother Nature. It was made by a monopoly, a bridge company that really was working for the Rock Island Railroad. And why, we already kind of got the idea, why Rock Island? Well, it was a good spot. Rock Island, there was a Black Hawk War, spoiler alert, did not end well for the Blackhawks. God help you, God Almighty help you if you're in the way. They were in the way. No, they were out of the way by this time. Well, the federal government builds a fort on Rock Island. Really good place to build forts, by the way. It's a really big, solid limestone rock, right in the middle of the Mississippi River. When the river hits it, heads to the west, goes around it to Davenport, and then farther down. So the rock is right there. The fort is abandoned after the end of the war. They don't need it anymore. The federal government secedes it to Illinois. Illinois says, well, if you're going to build a bridge, of course, they want to see that bridge. Why don't you put it here? Across the river, city of Davenport. Now I have Rock Island, and I have Council Bluffs. So you kind of see how this works. Why the Hellgate? Why call it the Hellgate? But why is it where it is? Now, it isn't perfect. There's a guy, Jeff Davis, and feel free to boo because I hate this guy, but he is at this time the Secretary of War for Franklin Pierce. He files suit to stop the Hellgate from being built. Why? Why does he care? Why does the Secretary of War have something to do with railroads or anything like that? Well, it wasn't necessarily that it was a rail bridge. It was, he didn't want the rail bridge at Rock Island, connecting to Davenport, connecting to Council Bluffs, connecting to Omaha. There was no bridge, Council Bluffs to Omaha, but that was going to happen. It's going to happen. What the route that Jeff Davis wanted was this route. The Gadsden Purchase. And you may remember the Gadsden flag, a yellow flag with a snake on it. Everybody, what does it say? Don't tread on me. So here you go. That was Grandpa Gadsden. This is a different Gadsden, his grandson. Buys this piece of land, and it's a good thing he did, because I actually lived in Tucson for a while. That's how we got Tucson. He buys it from Mexico for $10 million. Now, inflation. The entire half of that basin from that map, you might recall, we bought from Napoleon for $14 million. 50 years later, we bought a piece of desert from Mexico for 10. Not a good buy, by the way. This was a piece of desert. Why did Mexico sell it? Because they probably were surprised that we were offering any money at all, because everything else we got from them, we just took it. So this is the kind of time we negotiated to buy it. And the idea behind this is, it was a southern route. I don't know if you've ever driven, I think it's Interstate 10. Have you ever driven from El Paso to somewhere in California? It's not flat, but it is much flatter than the rest of the Rocky Mountains, much flatter. The problem is it's a desert. It's really hard to build things in a desert at any time of year. But you can see it was finally completed in 1886, well past Promontory Point. But that's what Davis wanted. The idea was to bring slavery to California in a way. I mean, it's kind of a quirky idea, but you can kind of see where that was going. It didn't work. So the idea is, well, what happened was there was a court case. Federal court said, you know, this is 2 states, Illinois, Iowa, they made an agreement to build a bridge. We're done. The Hell Gate's going to go through. So Davis loses his case. Good. I hate that guy. So what did it look like? It was really sort of 5 bridgelets, if you want to think of them that way. All wood, by the way. Wood, and then, of course, spikes, things that, you know, metal to hold it together, some cables, and rails. That was it. So it's limestone piers, 5 bridgelets, and then in the middle was a rotating bridge. And this is a rail bridge. It was not, you know, there was no, just rails. That's all it cost. And the idea behind that bridge is that gate, the Hell Gate, would swing open when there was a ship to pass through, and then swing closed when a train would come through. Now, when it opened, 1856, sorry, there were only 4 trains a day. So, you know, it was coming, it was building, but it really wasn't that popular. Who wanted to go to, well, I mean, Council Bluffs? I mean, everyone saw the vision, but what did you actually want to pay for? So that's where we were. The bridge was almost always, or the gate, I would say, is almost always open. That was, you know, sort of the background for this. Here's some photographs of it. The Hell Gate was there for a long time, so I don't know these were, you know, this early, contemporary what I'm talking about. But you can kind of see the idea, the dimensions of it. You could still pass under the bridge. Of course, you'd have to have a pretty short steamship to get under there. So again, this shows the gate being closed. I don't know if a train just passed, or they did it for the photograph. But you can kind of get an idea about what it looked like. There was this big limestone pier. You can see there. That was built. That wasn't there. And it was in the river at the time. And there was a house on there to house the guy who, I'm not really sure the means of how, but he would turn that bridge on like a big turntable. I think it was manual, but I don't really know how that worked. There was no engine to do it, so it had to be manual. Now, the Effie Afton. So we kind of set the stage for the Hell Gate. We know where it's there, where it's built. It opens in 1856. But our protagonist is the Effie Afton. So what was the Effie Afton? Or who was the Effie Afton? And I'm a little bit proud of myself for figuring this out, because it took a little detective work. Effie Afton, I got this thing that it's a poet, not necessarily noted poet, but for the time that when the ship called the Effie Afton was being built, she was sort of popular. And here it is. I actually found a book written by the Effie Afton, which is actually a pen name of somebody named Sarah E. Monmouth. Now, it has nothing to do with the presentation. I was just so happy to find this out. I just wanted to show you that I did this research and found it. By the way, I have a little sampling of poetry. I'm not going to read it because it's really bad. Anyway. So why Effie Afton? Why did they name a steamship Effie Afton? So my joke is it was probably the builder, the owner, whoever is commissioning that ship. They wanted, it was a sentimental thing. They wanted to name it after their wife, their ex-wife, their mother-in-law. And War Eagle was already taken as a name, so they couldn't use War Eagle. So the idea behind the Effie, there's no photographs I could find. I looked everywhere. And there are many articles about the thing I'm talking about in this presentation available if you want to find them. Just Google the Effie Afton, you'll find them. So it looked like this. It's about the same size. There was an article where they showed this picture. They said it's very close. So I have to guess that it's true that it's very close. It's about 235 feet long, 35 feet wide. And the width is really important in this story, 35 feet wide. It drew, the draft was about 4 feet. So what you see is what you get on a riverboat. There's some ballast below the waterline, but there's nothing below the waterline. The idea is that you wanted to go many places, which meant shallow draft was what you wanted. And you can kind of see it's like a layer cake. They call it the layer cake design. The first level was fuel and everything else that wasn't people. So it could be anything. It might be cattle, horses, hogs, bulk lumber coming out of Minnesota. It could be agricultural goods, but that wasn't really built up yet. It was coming along, but it wasn't really there yet. The next layer of the cake was passengers. Everything that wasn't cargo was on the next layer. Above that, what they called it, they called this the Texas deck, which was the crew, captain, anybody who wasn't a passenger was on the top of the layer cake, and then the absolute top of the cake was the wheelhouse. So that's where they would steer the ship, pilot the ship, they called it, when you were controlling it. The other remarkable thing interesting thing about this, these ships had rudders, but most of them had side paddle wheels. 2 engines, 2 steam engines, 2 boilers, 2 big pistons to drive these paddle wheels. And the nice thing about that design is you didn't have to run the paddles at the same speed. So even if the rudder wouldn't steer you very well, you could run the 2 wheels at different speeds and effectively steer the ship. Not only that, you could run one of those wheels backwards and one of them forwards. And you could turn rarely sharp, and pretty sharp. For a long ship like this, you didn't have to rely on the rudder to turn the whole ship. The wheels could sort of pull you around. And apparently there were places in the Mississippi River that you needed to turn 90 degrees if you were going to go up the river, up to St. Paul. So very handy to have that. This was built, the Effie was built in 1855, commissioned November that year. But it's going to meet the Hellgate pretty soon here. So what happens? So I got my stage, I got my protagonist, the Effie, and this is a great painting. I'm not sure how well you can see it because there's a lot of detail in this. And some of you sitting in the back. This is a painting of Effie going on her date with the Hellgate. So this is about 5 a.m. in the morning. I want to emphasize it wasn't in the dark of night. The ship, riverboats really didn't operate at night because of what they could hit. And the idea is, why waste, a boat, a perfectly good boat? So they would wait for dawn. This is 5 a.m. The sun was certainly not up. This is May, Rock Island. But you can see it. If you look really close, you can actually see the Hellgate in this painting. It's right here. And the Effie's coming up the river. She's going from Cincinnati to St. Paul with a load of cargo and passengers, and she is approaching the gate. So, what happens? Now, I read so many accounts of this. Nobody ever did a damn drawing of it, so I finally, I said, okay, I'm just going to draw this out. This is to scale. So the width of the Effie is this orange thing here, 34 feet, you remember that. The width of the gate, the Hellgate, and they only used one side for whatever reason, 114 feet. So if you think about this, it is kind of a Hellgate. You got to thread the needle here. I mean, that's a big ship. And she has to pass through this gate to get upstream to St. Paul. Now, the thing on that morning, there was another ship in the water, the smaller ship, ahead of the Effie. Now, the pilot of the Effie said, we've got the faster ship. So why is it that I'm letting that guy go first? So he speeds up a little bit. Now, this is where he's coming up to the gate. Speeds up a little bit. Of course, the pilot of the smaller ship says, wait, we're first. We should go through the gate first. So he speeds up a little bit. So you kind of see where this is probably not a good thing. So the Effie, when it gets to the gate, it's going about 12 knots. It's not super fast, but not slow either. And it's fighting a 2-knot, about roughly 2-knot current. It changes year to year. in different times of the year, but in that particular morning, it's estimated 2 knots. So she comes into this draw. So they call that the draw. The thing that you go through, a draw bridge is the thing that you can see it's turned. This is the rail bridge turned this way. And normally, or rather when the train would come through, it would turn this way to complete the bridge. So we know this is all true. There are witnesses. There are people going out about their business. It's early morning, but not that early. People in Davenport are watching this. People on the Illinois side of the river are watching this. By the way, north is this direction. So this is all to the side like that. I just tried to straighten it up to make it easy. So we know all this happens. You can kind of see, as best I could, it made everything to scale and accurate because it was driving me crazy. I just wanted to see visually in my own mind what this really looked like. So we know this is how it starts. And that's how it ends. So, what happens to the Effie? Now there's a lot of witnesses. And the weird thing about this is, and it's always noted when they talk about it, no one seems to be able to agree exactly what happened. Now there's people on the Effie. There was a boat now following the Effie through the gate. Remember the one that they were racing? It wasn't there where nobody saw it. It was light. They couldn't even agree what time it was that all this happened. You think that, they had watches, pocket watches, but apparently time was not standardized. That was the railroads going to do that later. It was like, whatever. Davenport probably had a clock somewhere in a steeple or a town hall. People set their watches by that. Illinois, probably different. People on the Effie probably use their own ship time or whatever. So nobody can agree exactly, not what happened, but when did it all happen. It's really frustrating. Kind of really a weird thing, but that's just the way it was. So we know one thing did happen. The Effie hits one of these piers. The long pier, with the gates on, open, or the short pier. Which one does it hit first? There's conflicting eyewitness testimony. Now they know it hits because they can hear it hitting, and they hear it sort of scrape along, but some people say, no, it hit on the starboard side, on the right side first. And somebody said, no, wait, it hit the long pier, I could see it. It hit the long pier first. Well, which was it? Well, I don't know, but what happens is, something happens to the starboard side of the Effie. The captain says, oh, we hit an eddy coming around that short pier, and we lost propulsion. And there's pretty thing like, yeah, you making this up, post-collision here. But he orders a turn to basically get away from the long pier, because that's what he feared. I mean, he figured he could get around the short pier even with damage. So he's trying to steer this way. He gets way over. Remember, you can run these paddle wheels at different speeds, and the current starts to catch it, and it pushes the Effie against the bridge. And what the captain says effectively is, I'm not going to get out of this. We're in a lot of trouble now. So the one thing that, beyond sinking, which was sort of fearsome if you think about it, not many people knew how to swim in these times, but what they feared more was boiler explosions. That was the thing. And there were boiler explosions. These are high pressure boilers, efficient, burn fuel very, very, at high pressure so they could push that piston around without using a lot of fuel. The thing is, when those exploded, they would kill not only a lot of people, and the people they didn't kill would wish they were dead, because you were probably going to be burned. There was no help for you once that happened. So he banked the boilers. What that means is he shut all the inputs. He told the engineer down on they have a little tube they can talk to the engineer on that lower deck where the boilers were, to shut off all the inputs so oxygen couldn't come in. And that stopped the boiler, stopped the fires from heating the water, and then release all the pressure out of the boilers so should something go wrong, it wouldn't explode. So that was the end. Once he banks the boilers, her fate is sealed in a way. How does she can't move anymore unless somebody can come and tow her off. Now, that's not enough. About this time, they hear a shout, fire. The Effie is burning. So somewhere in this whole collision mess, there was a stove, and they said it was a pastry stove, and I didn't know pastry was a thing on steamships, I guess so, but it spilled coals onto the deck. They had some sand buckets, and they had buckets to get water, but they couldn't keep up, and by the time, the ship comes around and hits that pier, it's on fire. It's burning on the passenger deck. So the fortunate thing is, the height of that bridge is about the same height as the Effie's passenger deck. So all they had to do is people walked out with some ladders, and also the ship that they had beaten to the draw also came around her, tied up, and the passengers all got out safe. No loss of life. Even the livestock that was on the cargo deck went into the water, and they recovered them downstream about a couple hundred yards. So even the livestock survives this. The Effie burns to the water line. The bridge burns because the bridge is made of wood, and she's smashed up against it. The bridge burns, that section of bridge falls into the water, and there's this great cheer about, hey, the Hellgate burned. So, and people are really happy, the observers are really happy because they didn't like the Hellgate. So, there it is. So that's the Effie meets the bridge, meets the Hellgate. That's not the end of the story. Chicago Saloon Building. So the owners of the Effie, bankrolled by the St. Louis Chamber of Commerce, sue the Rock Island Railroad. Why not the bridge company? Well, the bridge company, the way that this works is you build the bridge, You dissolve the company, you sell the bridge to somebody else. You want to own a bridge, you want to own the money that you made off the bridge. That's what you want. So they sell it to the Rock Island Railway. The Rock Island Railway owns the Hellgate. It's federal court, because it's two states, you know, two states argument here. Ominously called the Chicago Saloon Building, downtown Chicago. Now already you can kind of think, it's not going to be a fair trial, you know. It's good in these days that that doesn't happen, right? You know, the venue doesn't help conclude that, you know, of course, and they did it those times as well. So there are some rumors about this. What did the trial look like? It's called Heard et al. Versus the Railroad Bridge Company. Even though it was the Railroad Bridge Company, it was really Rock Island Railway. The court. So who was in the court? What was this guy? John McLean. He was a Supreme Court justice, one of the only two justices to disagree with the Dred Scott decision. You remember that some people weren't people, according to the Constitution. McLean disagreed. So already you kind of get an idea, maybe the measure of John McLean. Now you remember that court case that we already had it, Jeff Davis's court case. McLean was the judge who decided that case in favor of the Hellgate. So why is he, you know, why did they pick him up? Well, I guess he's a circuit rider. In those days, Supreme Court justices would go out into the land and try cases in federal court. And of course, they probably picked him as a very, I mean, they weren't any fools about picking him as the judge for this trial. Now, you can kind of guess why. Okay, the plaintiffs. Now, these are the people that own the Effie Afton, again, bankrolled by St. Louis Chamber of Commerce. According to Beckwith, he was semi-famous. He becomes the lieutenant governor of Illinois. So, I mean, these are, you know, people who have some political ambitions. Interesting enough, Timothy Danielson Lincoln, not any relationship except through some, you know, maybe name to the Lincoln we're just about to see. So these are the plaintiffs, and a judge, a former judge, the defendants, or the defender, the defending team lawyers. Norman Judd, who was a lawyer for the Rock Island Railway, and they hired this guy, and Joseph Knox, they were both lawyers for the Rock Island Railway. They hired this guy, Abraham Lincoln. So this is a book, I actually have the book here, Lincoln's Greatest Case. You know, yeah, you love that people put Lincoln in the titles of their stuff, so you get attracted, like it works, by the way. So the whole thing about this trial, the way that it summarizes a weak case, the plaintiff's case, argued weakly. You know, they didn't have a good case, but they didn't want to just go after the Rock Island Railway for damages. They wanted the Hellgate to be declared an impediment to transportation, and of course, by doing so, have it torn down. So that was the idea. You know, we're tearing down the Hellgate. So the Hellgate's Act, you know, and you're thinking, gee, the Rock Island Railway is saying, you know, it's not just, you know, Davenport or Council Bluffs. I want Omaha. I want Denver. I want Utah. I want a San Francisco Bay on my monopoly route. See the shining sea, just like the song says. So they don't want to lose that Hellgate. I mean, they could probably build another one, but they don't want to lose that one. So they're fighting this case. The trial. This is supposedly an accurate drawing. Here's an interesting thing about this case. Whoever writes about it or wants to research it. There were, obviously, it was a federal case. There were people that recorded everything said at that trial. Unfortunately, Miss McNeely's cow has another idea and kicks the lamp, and the federal court building where they keep all the records, well, was in Chicago. So 1871, those records are gone. There's no record of this, what was really said in this trial, except two newspaper accounts. One written by a reporter for the, I think it was Chicago Star, and one written by a reporter for the St. Louis Dispatch. Now you can imagine that they don't agree on almost anything. In fact, nothing, effectively. So they both report everything said at the trial, but couldn't have been true because they don't agree with what was said at the trial. So there you go. Again, another confusing point on this. Now, they argue the case. I'm just going to summarize basically some of the arguments. Oh, the jury was 12 white men. You had to be a white man to be on a jury in the United States at that time. Certainly a federal jury for sure. Now, being that it was above the saloon, it wasn't easy it wasn't really very difficult to sequester a jury. You just went downstairs about lunchtime, and there were some jurors there right there. Now, besides being a white man, you had to be not an indigent, which meant you had to have a place of residence, an address, or a business with an address. And the idea was, because if you didn't show up for jury duty, they wanted to know how to go find you. So you had to have that. They found these, they picked 14 guys, 2 were rejected. But if you look at some of these accounts, 10 of the jury, 10 of the 12 had some ties to the railroad. Well, they were in Chicago, 120 trains a day. One actually owned stock in a rail company. He was still on the jury. One actually owned a restaurant kind of thing in a train station. You'd think there'd be some bias there. He was on the jury. So there's a thing where they go up the biography of every single juror of these 12 jurors, and if you start looking at it, you're thinking, what? You gotta be kidding me. How is this going to be fair? But that was the jury. So the idea was the bridge itself, its design caused the accident. That was the plaintiff's case. And all they did was effectively argue that back and forth. So Lincoln has this bottle of the bridge and all these currents, and apparently they said it was just so confusing, nobody could figure out what he was saying. He was certainly not an expert at water or currents or anything like that. But he was the one that argued for the defense about the bridge design. They said it was terrible. Whatever he said just confused everybody, which wasn't a bad thing. If you think about it, the more confusion, the less chance you have, the more chance you have a reasonable doubt on the plaintiff's case. So not a bad strategy. Maybe there's Lincoln intending to do it. There was a pilot that was brought in for the plaintiffs to argue against, and he gets up on the witness stand and he starts talking, and they're asking him questions, and he sort of he kind of goes off script, and he says, well, any pilot worth his pay could navigate the Hellgate and go right through it. Of course, what he's saying is all the other pilots in Mississippi are bad, I'm the good one, right? So he's bragging and on the witness stand. Of course, they didn't expect him to say that. It's really bad that he said that. So basically, it's not a bad thing. Any competent pilot can go right through that Hellgate, no problem. So not good for the plaintiffs. And it sort of turns on the testimony of one person, more or less. It's the bridge keeper, the guy who opens the gate. Of course, the gate almost always open. So you have nothing to do but watch what happens. Now, again, they still disagree on where the Effie hits first, what happens, the captain's account was completely different. But Lincoln, I call Lincoln the father of all dad jokes, if you kind of know what I mean. He questions this guy, and he tells us later, he tells us as one of his favorite, sort of humorous, not really funny stories that drove everybody crazy because he heard it many times before. But he talks about this guy's testimony. And it goes something like this. He asked the caretaker, the bridge opener guy, he says, well, can you recollect, sir, how many ships have passed through the Hellgate? And he answers back, as kind of an old crotchety guy, he says, no, sir, I cannot recollect that. That's why I wrote it down. So Lincoln thinks this is a funny joke, but there you go. I mean, that's a dad joke for you. And he had written it down. He had the records there, right, for the court to see. So 12 different ships, and it was only opened, a couple weeks before all this happened. 12 different ships hit the Hellgate. That's a lot. You think about it. But he goes further. In almost 1,000 ships passed through it with no incident. So that bit of testimony, if you're thinking, okay, I'm on the jury, of course I'm biased anyway, it sort of gives the jury their green light to say, we're going to declare ourselves a hung jury. Because they didn't want to get in trouble, but they kind of saw, the writing on the wall, hung jury. Of course, if in a case where you're suing for damages, a hung jury is effectively the same as not guilty. The thing is, it leaves open for another case to be brought, but your case has failed. You're not going to get damages, you're not going to get the Hellgate torn down. So that's how this ends. Just want to kind of conclude here. I'm going to skip that. Today, multiple Hellgates have been built. They moved from the original thing downriver and have actually been across this bridge. And that's what it looks like today. So it's called the Government Bridge, one of the oldest continuing operating bridges across the Mississippi, slated to be torn down and replaced. So if you really want to see this bridge or cross it, this is the time to get there. Get there as soon as you can. There is a museum Well, they have Effie's bell. They went and found it, pulled it up, reassembled it. It's the Museum of the Mississippi River. It's right downtown Davenport. So you can see Effie, a piece of Effie there. There's a marker that says the original first bridge across the Mississippi, which is wrong. Since I'm a guest of this fair city, I should basically make clear. Snelling Avenue, where it crosses into Nicollet Island, that was the first bridge across the Mississippi. Not that bridge you see, but it was a a rope suspension bridge. So I don't want to get in trouble with the city of Minneapolis and say that this was the first. It wasn't the first bridge. It was the second bridge, the first rail bridge across the Mississippi. And there's this went up in 2016. Lincoln, supposedly, this is apocryphal, that term, apocryphal, a story, where Lincoln shows up at Davenport and quizzes this little kid who happens to be sitting there fishing or whatever he's doing, and he builds his case based on the conversation. There's no record this ever happened, and what somebody says is, well, so if Lincoln was working for the Rock Island Railroad Company, he would have billed for these hours. He would have, at the right time, he would have billed for those hours. He's not going to do it for free. He had to travel all the way from Chicago to Davenport and back and spend time. He's not going to there's no record of Lincoln ever billing for any of this. So did it ever happen? Well, maybe. But, there's a statute now, so I guess it did. So thank you. That was my story, my sidebar story about Lincoln and Elvis.
Any questions for George?
One correction, the steamboat bell is actually at the Browning Museum at Rock Island Arsenal.
Oh, it's at the Arsenal. Okay, all
I
right.
saw it there in September.
The Rock Island Arsenal is a great place to visit, by the way. If you like guns or collections or gun collections.
The museum is closed for a total redo for at least the next
Okay, yeah, great museum. I love that museum. Rock Island Arsenal. Thanks.
How did you ever get into this story?
It's a weird question, but I thank you for the question. So this is how almost all my presentations happen. I'm looking for something. I'm doing a story which we almost did for this. I almost did for this on Poop's Turtles. It was actually mentioned. The designer Poop built these. They called it the city class ironclads that Mississippi River Squadron going up and down the river. And for whatever reason, Michelle, I'm getting tired, punchy, whatever. In my own mind, this question forms. Were there any bridges across the Mississippi River during the Civil War? And there were two. One was a road bridge, you know where it is, and the Hellgate. And then I thought, what the hell is this Hellgate? And that's the whole story. That's exactly how I stumbled on this, completely looking for something else, but just asking the question, were there any bridges across the Mississippi River during the Civil War? And the Hellgate, by the way, turns out to be an important bridge because it connects a whole lot of the Union with, together, versus the Confederates that had no bridges across the Mississippi, and it really hurt them. So there we go.
Just a comment. The bridge down in Davenport, it's called the truss method. It's called the worn with vertical with arch.
Yeah.
And the suspension bridge we had up here can't handle no suspension bridge can handle a train.
Right, because the force of the train.
Yeah, you got it completely unbalanced of the start of the train coming on.
But for $25, you could get a team and a wagon across the suspension bridge at Nicollet Island, and you didn't have to unhitch the team. So there you go. It was a formidable bridge. It wasn't just like one of the road bridges, Indiana Jones things. It was a real bridge. So, thank you. Anybody else? Questions?
Yes.
I said one other historical comment. You mentioned that John McLean was the Supreme Court Justice on there. He was the father of Nathaniel McLean, who stopped Longstreet on Chinch Ridge at Second Manassas, and also the stepfather of Kenner Garrard, who was the head of Sherman's cavalry at one time, and also he had a brigade on Little Round Top after Weed got killed. And there were two other Garrard brothers, Israel and Jephthah, and they all hailed from, at one time or another, from Frontenac, Minnesota. So.
Yeah, it's good. Isn't it good in our modern age that federal courts aren't biased anymore? Aren't we just so pleased with that? But there's another bias. Since I'm just going to go over here, but another bias in this thing is that Lincoln introduces McLean at what was the Whig convention of 1860. It's not like they didn't know each other. McLean runs for president in that election and loses the nomination to Fremont. But, you know, it's sort of like, it's all like one big, and it still is, all one big conglomeration of lawyers, pointing at Tom. But, you know, the idea is that it hasn't changed, has it? Really, it has not changed. And it wasn't any different back then. There was no purity in any of this stuff. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed your television.